and move on down. It's not scary down at the front or anything like that. This isn't church where you have to kind of hang out at the back and hope to escape early. I want to I want to thank everybody for coming today. Yeah, please do come on down. We're going to kind of see how this goes depending on how much time we have left. I want to talk for a little bit, and then I'd actually like this to be a little bit more interactive towards the end. So we just had this really kind of inspiring speech from Ashwan, all their like fighting the man in Wisconsin and doing all this great stuff. And now I get to be really depressing and tell you how you really shouldn't fight the man. No, it's not entirely true, but I do want, as sort of an overarching thing here, as we all get into sort of into the weeds on ideas in the Strong Towns movement, I do think it's important that we be pretty tough with each other. This is not work for the meek. It's very, very hard. And I think it's important for us all to kind of toughen each other up and prepare ourselves for hard choices, because I think we have a lot of very hard choices coming in the years ahead. I don't know how many of all of you, get interested in the whole sort of financial independence, personal finance world, Mr. Money Mustaches of the world and everything else. There's also a woman in that world named Paula Pant. She has a great podcast and a saying that says, you can have anything, but you can't have everything. And I think the same thing is true when it comes to our cities, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Kevin Klinkenberg. I'm the Executive Director of Savannah Development and Renewal Authority in Savannah, Georgia. I've been in Savannah for about 7 years. You can probably tell by lack of an accent that I'm not from there. Wouldn't be hard to discern that. Originally actually from the Midwest, and spent really most of my adult life in Kansas City. Spent about 17 years there. It's really great to spend some time here with so many sort of very smart and committed people. Also great to see a room full with a lot of people who are obviously younger than I am, which is a rarity at times. I'm one of those kind of unicorns that's like a Gen X guy. If for like demographers don't really think we exist, or think there's like 5 of us, that exist in the country, and maybe 2 or 3 of them are here in this room at once. So take a close look. We're kind of a rare species, but I think it's really important. I do think at the core of a lot of our work is a generational shift in thinking and approach to these problems. And whether it comes to transportation or the planning of our cities, there was a shift that in perception and attitudes that I think generally starts with people who are around, within a few years of my age. I'm 47 years old. But with that, I also want to say, look at this. Is that just not the sexiest thing you've ever seen? Isn't that fantastic? Don't you just immediately want one? I mean, come on. I show this to say, look, I think it's important that we be realistic about, American society and about the culture of cars and car ownership that we have here. Look, I'm an urbanite. I love to walk. My wife and I sold a car last year, so we're a 1-car family now. We use Uber and Lyft a lot. We walk and ride bikes, and we love it. We love that lifestyle. When the robots come and take over Uber vehicles completely, I'm sure we'll use them. But there is a huge, huge segment of the population that is not at all interested in that. And if you don't get the raw human appeal of getting, behind the wheel of a powerful vehicle and driving it, then you're not understanding human nature. And there is a large constituency of people who are going to fight to the death to retain that, right? They're not going to be riding around in robot-driven vehicles. And they want their fast cars, their powerful cars, the big trucks, and they like their car-oriented lifestyle in suburbia. And I think we have to be honest about that. Now we've seen incredible trends the last, really in all of my adult life, to the point now where we've hit this great tipping point that even the National Realtors Association admits that about half of the population really wants to live a different kind of lifestyle. They want to live in a walkable place, however that is defined. But there is also this constituency of people that love their suburbia, and there's not much that a lot of us are going to do to change all of that. So I would submit that we shouldn't try to change that. That we should work as hard as we can to have success in the places where we have a great chance of success. A lot of this presentation and this thinking, I've written a fair amount about it, and there was a long piece that was on the Strong Towns blog this week. A lot of this thinking came as sort of a reaction to many of my dear friends in the New Urbanism movement, which is something I've been involved with for 20 years. And by the way, if you're interested, the next Congress for the New Urbanism in 2018 will be in Savannah, where we'll be hosting it. I'd invite you all to come, and I hope we'll have a large, strong towns presence there as well. But a lot of my dear friends in that world really think, there are a lot of brilliant people, and they get really excited about drawing beautiful, absolutely beautiful drawings of how you can transform cul-de-sacs, subdivisions, and stroads, and all sorts of the sort of typical manner of suburbia, and make it into this wonderful walkable urbanism. And my first reaction when I used to see a lot of this was, wow, that's amazing. It's really cool to see it. And then you stop and think about it, and you're like, who's going to do that? And how good is it really going to be? What we're really striving for are a lot of scenes like this. This is my neighborhood coffee shop in Savannah. And, I think a lot of us are really hopeful that we can create enough great places in the world that have this kind of a feel to it, and a little bit less of this, right? We have these two very distinct worlds, the urban worlds, which are really built on how cities have been built for centuries, which is built around human beings and walking. And we have the suburban experiment, which is built around driving. And I would submit that we can't fix it all. And as much as we might want to, as much as we might have the ideals that it would be great to fix it all, we can't. There's too much of it. There's too much of it, and there are too many people who love it. And they will fight you with every fiber of their being if you try to change it. And what we really need to focus on is to triage what we can actually do and do with excellence. Because it's really excellence that convinces people to come over to your side of the argument. So when you have spaces like this and experiences like this, where you say, wow, that's amazing, I loved it. That's what tends to change people's minds. Mediocrity doesn't change minds. And if you don't believe me, think about just your own personal experience. How did you get interested in all of this to begin with? There are a lot of people, certainly of my age, who really began to get interested in this when they visited European cities and towns as part of, exchange programs and college study programs in the 1980s and 90s. And I mean, I know this because, I did it. I grew up in very typical suburban environments. I talked about it with a lot of my friends, went to these places, and we'd visit these incredible cities and towns in other countries, and we go, wow, this is amazing. Why don't we have this in the United States? And it wasn't sort of the half measures that excited us. It was the quality, the complete quality of those places that sometimes look and feel like this, or like that. And this is what inspires people. This is actually the funny thing. This is a little town in France called Narbonne, which I'm going to guess that probably none of you have been to. It's just a little nothing city in southern France of probably 50,000 people, but it's incredible, and it's just a run-of-the-mill small city in that part of the world. And yet you go there and you spend a day walking the streets, and you see that, you experience the lifestyle, and it's transformative. So I think that's what in our efforts we really need to focus on. We need to focus on where can we have not just success, but success based around excellence that builds a constituency of people that will work for more of this. Now, I love this stuff. I don't want you to come away from this presentation thinking that I'm saying don't do this. The tactical urbanism, Jason Roberts, Better Block, he's a genius. And I absolutely love what has happened to cities as a result of this. But I don't think we can tweak our way into making our systems better. So this is where I sound a little bit like a grumpy kind of older guy. But, well, I've been doing this for 20 years, that sort of thing. But I have been doing this for 20 years. And let me just tell you, it's really, really hard. It's incredibly hard. The attitudes are so deeply ingrained that we are working against. All of the systems that produce the communities that we have, whether it's transportation or planning or land use, are very entrenched and very, very difficult to change. Some of them can change with different people in charge, but especially in really large cities and larger regions, it's just unbelievably difficult to make any kind of wholesale system change to produce the critical mass that I think a lot of us are looking for. So I don't think we're going to tweak our way into making things better. I think we're going to have to look for some other ways to advance the conversation, especially when it comes to transportation, because transportation is really the linchpin that is really getting in the way of so many of our communities reaching their potential as places that people really want to live in, that have a walkable feel to it. So I think this is kind of what we're after. This is one view in Savannah. I think we're going to have to look at some different approaches to how we get there. And that's really the crux of this presentation, which is how do we focus? Where do we focus? How do you focus your energies? You all come from different disciplines. Maybe some of you are planners, maybe some of you are transportation people, some are elected officials. You at the end, at sort of at the end of each day, you have to look and say, where can I be the most effective? How do I marshal my limited resources? How do I convince enough people to get X, Y, or Z done? And it's very difficult to change the whole system. This is where I can sound a little bit, like John Sanfilippo, who just thinks that it's impossible to change it all. And it's basically going to just continue as it is until it collapses, which is possible. It's very hard to argue with that. Having worked sort of inside and outside of a lot of our transportation and planning systems, it's very difficult to argue that a lot of these things just won't change. So what I'd like to do is figure out how we get enough of the high quality work and the high quality spaces that really builds a constituency that will ultimately make the greatest change. I couldn't resist doing this while I was here. Now I'm back in the middle of the country where everything is like a 1 square mile grid, So I did this back a few years ago, just for fun, as a presentation dealing with the Western grid. This is actually the historic district of Savannah, which is 1 square mile. And if you come, and if you've been there, I hope you come and visit at some point. It is a remarkable example of just how great of a place you can make in a pretty small area. You can even see on the western edge of that, there's some urban renewal that was done that really screwed up sort of the left half of that image. But still, 1 square mile is really all it takes in our region's case to create a destination that literally millions of people want to visit every year, and is the economic engine for an entire region. So, that's all to say, if you have the opportunities to just do a square mile or 2 square miles, and you think that's just not enough, you need more, don't think that way. You can make remarkable strides in a pretty small area if you just focus on your ability to have success there. So So this is where I get a little bit, I want to put an idea out there that's a little bit, it's a little bit different. Maybe it's strong townish, maybe it's not. We'll talk about it. But I think we have to figure out how we build constituencies that will pursue excellence. And I don't think, like I said, that we can necessarily tweak a lot of our systems into success. I think there are cases in the vast majority of American cities. Most cities are not Savannah, where they have this remarkable historic fabric. And so, in fact, Savannah has all of the same suburban sprawl as every other city in the country. Okay, what we do have is we are lucky to have this incredible urban plan that was done in 1733 and was extended and built upon for 150 years that basically has just been inherited by today's generations, who frankly still don't necessarily understand why it works so well. So we have all of the same problems and issues with our systems as everywhere else. In fact, yesterday I lost a frustrating battle with our city council and with our traffic engineers to traffic calm two streets that run right through the middle of our downtown, that are basically like little mini highways that go directly through the middle of the most populated areas of the historic district. 2-lane, one-way streets that people routinely drive 40 miles an hour on, and create really terrible conditions, terrible safety conditions, documented all kinds of safety data, documented property value data. And in the end, the engineers just weren't going to be convinced. They said that those roads, which carry between 6,000 and 8,000 cars a day, needed the capacity of 2 lanes, which is insane. I mean, let's be honest, that's insane. But that's indicative of what we are up against. And it's these issues are really, really hard, even in a place where you have incredible bones. But most of our cities are like Tulsa. Most of our American cities are like this, where we are, where you have a very small amount of pre-war urban fabric that has potential to be really good. You have some other neighborhoods that could be okay, or are pretty nice. And you have an enormous amount of suburbia and a lot of land that is going to be very hard to make it anything other than what it is. So how do you have success in that? So my new urbanist friends often will say, well, we need to take all of these suburban stroads and sort of make them into boulevards. And then we need to have mixed use at all the corners. And then we can reconnect to the cul-de-sacs and make all this work. And I say, that sounds great, but where's the money come from to do all that? And where does the demand come from to fill all of that space? I mean, there just isn't enough population to fill all of that space to make it all mixed use and walkable in our country, unless all of a sudden we change our immigration policies and we bring another 500 million people in, which doesn't seem like that's happening anytime soon. So part of what this proposition here is that for a lot of the typical American cities, you need to find a way to break that paradigm completely. And I want to show just 3 kind of quick case studies and what I mean by that. I think this is probably going to be a book. I've started to work on it, but I want to put this out there as a thought for you all to take a look at and critique. And that is, in many cases, find a way to create something that is almost outside the system. So in each of these cases, these were kind of some top-down efforts, but they worked outside of the typical planning transportation system. The first one is the Beltline in Atlanta. How many people are familiar with the Beltline in Atlanta? Okay, that's great. That's a lot of people. I got to tell you, Atlanta is one of the most car-centric cities in the country. For a lot of us, it's kind of been the poster child for suburban sprawl. And what has happened with the Beltline is remarkable. It's absolutely not what a lot of us in the planning and new urbanist world would recommend to do. because basically what they did as part of this effort was to say, we're going to opt out of the street network in Atlanta, and we're just going to use this kind of network of old railroad right-of-ways and other creative ways to have a connection to create this loop around most of the downtown and midtown neighborhoods. And we're going to make really high quality pedestrian and bike and public space all along that route. And all I can say at this point is it's been utterly transformative, and in how people in Atlanta think about their city and how they use their city. It's basically was funded and is set up and monitored by an authority that is outside of the planning and transportation system. Okay, I'm not saying these are ideal or perfect ways to do things, but sometimes it's too hard to have pushed a project like that through the normal sort of meat grinder of local politics. But this was able to happen. And now what you are seeing as a result of this is unbelievable demand and development along the Beltline and in all of the Midtown neighborhoods. And they're creating enough of a constituency that they're finally starting now to change some of the actual streets within the Midtown neighborhoods and traffic calm them and make them more pedestrian friendly. But the key is they did something, and it's not done yet, by the way, too. It's the whole route is not connected or done. But the key is they did it really well. And it has created a constituency of people who love it and are really now into walking and biking and are willing to lobby for more of it. And that's kind of, at the meat of all this. And if you look at that loop that's on the screen, again, this is not a large area. Atlanta is an enormous region, obviously, 6 million people. But if we overlaid this Beltline on a map of even the city of Atlanta, it's a fairly small defined area that, they said, we're going to focus on this. And this area is going to be the part of the city that we care the most about in order to make this work. So the second one is actually I get to use my old hometown here in Kansas City. So this will be fun. So Kansas City, when I lived there for 17 years and was with a group of people who we were advocates for transit and streetcars and everything else. Well, last year they actually finally opened a streetcar line in the downtown area, 2-mile line. Nothing about that is remarkable. Streetcars themselves and transit and light rail projects have been around for years. And, some of them have worked pretty well. Some of them haven't worked very well. Nothing about that in and of itself was a big deal. But I think what they've done is a big deal that is a lesson for other American cities to learn is that the streetcar system is free. Okay? After about 25 years of failed attempts to build a light rail system in the city, and the reason they all failed is because they were all too expansive. They wanted to cover all the suburban areas to the north and the south, cover areas, east and west. And so they had these enormous systems that covered that with huge price tags. And most people just really had a hard time grasping how it would benefit or improve their lives very much. What they did have is they always had support within the core part of the city, the part of the city that could most benefit from it and could most be enhanced by really high quality public transit. That part of the city always supported it. And so they figured out a funding mechanism to pay for construction and operation and actually make it free to the public. Now that's kind of heresy in a lot of quarters. But I think again, we have to think a little bit differently in most of our American cities that are so car oriented in order to shift people into other modes of transportation. And this has been a runaway success and spurred a development boom along the streetcar corridor, the likes of which Kansas City has never seen. When it's likely to be extended and we'll kind of finish a 6-mile corridor, but that's it. That's really the only area that people are, talking about that it will serve. It will serve this 6-mile swath of the city that has the most potential to be productive and to be excellent. because there just isn't enough value in extending it much beyond that. So that's an interesting case study to watch. You know, the reality of most of our transit systems is something I've kind of argued for a while, but most of our bus and transit systems, they capture such an unbelievably tiny percentage of revenue back from the fare box. I think the average for American bus systems is around 20 to 25% of operations is covered by fare box revenue, which is a pathetic amount. And the reality is, because riding the bus in most of our cities is a lousy experience. And so this idea of to say, well, if it covers so little of it, you know, let's find some other funding mechanisms, make it free, and actually push ridership to the system. And that ridership will ultimately change perceptions and development patterns. And that's kind of the risk that they're taking. It's a risk, but I think it's one that's definitely worth watching. So the third and final thing, so, you know, obviously we talk a lot about pricing and money. You know, I think sometimes that if there's like a secret sauce to really changing our cities, it's any sort of subversive ways that we can get to how things are paid for, and how transportation is paid for, how things are priced. Parking benefit districts and transportation benefit districts have been around for a long time. But the work that Don Shoup has put forward, especially with parking benefit districts that he started in earnest in Pasadena and other places, has also been transformative, because if for nothing else, it has really attacked one area that is so crucial. So I think all of you, if you live in an urban neighborhood, if you care about cities and development, you're very familiar with the fact that there's such an internal, like, NIMBY resistance to change, period. We can call it whatever we want, but there's just a lot of people who don't want their neighborhood to change. They might live in an urban neighborhood that embodies change and embodies all of the things, you know, that Chuck talked about earlier, where how cities transition and change over decades, but there's still a very large constituency of people who just don't want any of that to change, period. It's amazing how that mindset shifts when money that is spent in their neighborhood gets captured and spent back in the neighborhood. And people immediately begin to see the value of additional revenue and development in their place. And so one of the things that has happened with some benefit districts like this is it has actually spurred more people who will say, yes, we do want that change. We want more of this. We want more development, because the results, you know, the money doesn't go into a big pot in the general fund to be spent citywide on 100 different projects. It goes into a much smaller pot that's seen and felt and touched in their own neighborhood. So there's a little bit of a secret sauce there for us all to study. All right, so this is where I get to my highly technical diagrams. And so again, the question is sort of where can you do all this and be successful? Because the goal of all this is for us to have success in the places that we're working in. I think whatever city you live in, you want it to be as good as it can possibly be. You know, if you're here, you're the kind of person who really cares about the place that you live in. And so I did this kind of funky analysis of the different kinds of urban and suburban communities, and I'll come back to this in a minute. If you're familiar with the New Urbanist Transect, this looks and feels a little bit like it, but it's kind of taking a look at, there are a few very different kinds of living environments that exist in our cities. One of them is this sort of big city urbanism that's embodied, even like downtown Tulsa would certainly fit in this regard. The next is what I would sort of call small city urbanism. So it's sort of like a step down. It's not obviously very large, you know, towers or anything else, but there's still substantial density and activity. And then there's sort of small town urbanism. This really is embodied by, you know, small towns all over the country. And the pattern of development that they all used to have and were built upon for generations. This happens to be a small town in Maine, but it could be anywhere, you know, anywhere USA, any small town USA. These are all different variations of living environments and scales where people walk. And none of these are right or wrong. we all like to live in different sort of environments throughout the course of our life. When you're really young, you might want to live in sort of the dynamic big city environment. When you get to have kids or something else, it might be more ideal to live in this kind of an environment, sort of a small town place where you can still walk and experience, a lifestyle that you enjoy, but you might have different needs and desires. I also just wanted to point out that suburbia is the same. It's not just kind of it's not any one thing. Okay, we tend to think of suburbia as all the same stuff everywhere in our world, but it's not. There are some variations that are important to take a look at. The first is the suburbia that we built immediately after World War II, up until the interstate system became ubiquitous through the early 1960s, is often built like this. It actually has a street grid, and it has some of the bones and elements that towns had before World War II, before we went to the 1 mile square grid pattern. Some of these places can be changed and transformed, although it's going to be very hard and expensive. But depending on their location, depending on the market, some of these really can be turned into sort of what I would call really high quality small town urbanism. We have sort of the standard suburban environment, most of which I would tell you to just leave it as it is. Don't worry about it. It's too hard. It's too hard to fix. Most of the people who live there like it the way it is. They may not tell you that, but you'd be surprised how many people you'll talk to who say they know exactly what they chose in that world and they're happy with it. They don't want to walk places. They like their cars. They like mowing a yard, right? Now, if you have an opportunity to say, take an old dying shopping mall and turn it into a town center or something like that, great. Those are wonderful things. But there'll always be little islands kind of in a sea of this stuff that it can never really connect to effectively, because all of this is too expensive and too difficult to wholesale change. That's my recommendation. The third are these master plan communities. The response starting sort of in the 70s and then picking up steam in the 80s and 90s to standard suburban sprawl was to do big master plan communities. And they would have a plan for 600 acres or 2,000 acres, and oftentimes built around a golf course. But they actually do have a mixture of houses and apartments and townhomes and shops, and not planned the way that I think most of us would like to plan them. But in effect, they operate a little bit like little towns, and it's important to understand that they're a little bit of a different animal. And then there's the kind of rural or exurban sprawl, which again is its whole different thing. And for the most part, I think is kind of foolish for us to wade into to try to really transform. So what I did is I actually graphed all those things. I did this fancy little deal where I had return on one side and risk on the other. And I highlighted the area where I thought these are the places where we really ought to focus our attention for the most part. So obviously the places with the highest possible return and the least risk are the places that match that quality, the different urban qualities. You'll notice on there that those pre-interstate suburbs and those master plan communities kind of hover very close to the edge. And that was on purpose as well, because if you're in a community where you've done most of what you can with a lot of your urban areas, but you have a lot of the sort of pre-interstate suburban environment, it might be possible to really work on that and connect it and retrofit it and make it really good. But you really have to evaluate that in a pretty harsh light. So our goal obviously is we're looking for walk-ins, right? We want people we want to create walkable places. We want to create these sort of successful places. Yeah, I know, I can't resist. So I took a little stab here at showing what does this look like on a map for where I live. Because it's instructive, I think, to think about, okay, you've got these different types of areas. How much land area does that take? This is Savannah and Chatham County, which is most of the Savannah region. The little area noted number 1 is kind of our big city urban area. It's pretty small, all right? Number 2 are the areas that I would say are sort of small city urban. Number 3 are that has sort of small town urban flavor. Really, a lot of those sort of streetcar era and early 20th century suburbs have sort of a small town urbanism feel to it. If time had allowed them to evolve, they probably would have evolved into a bigger city feel. But obviously the Depression hit and then the war, and then we changed everything after that. But they really have sort of a small town feel today. And then I highlighted, you can see around the edge of the 2s and the 3s, those are the areas that sort of have that pre-interstate suburban feel to them. The big red areas are 3 large master plan communities that are in our region. And everything else that's not colored is standard suburban sprawl. And it's all pretty much built and developed. So this is a little daunting, like when you put it on a map and say, what can we do? You know, what can we make really great? And this is, you know, that sort of colored in area at the top is really about the limits of what I think can ever truly be excellent in our region. And what I would encourage everybody to do is to take a look at that in their own place as well. And that gives you a sense, then a better sense of where can I intervene and actually make a difference in people's lives. So I'm just going to end with a couple of overarching thoughts here. I'd love, I was kind of hopeful we could do kind of workshop this a little bit. I think what we may do is just do some questions and discussion at the end. Liz Plater-Zyberk really taught me this, which I think it was always excellent, which is when you talk about what the world that we work in of community building, you always want to think about there are these 3 different ways that impact our lives: design, policy, and management. And each of them are important. And if you think about transportation, you can think about all the different ways that, you know, they might have a design characteristic, they certainly have a policy characteristic, and the management often is, you know, who's in charge, who makes the decisions. And as you look at your own regions or cities, you have to think about kind of all 3 of these in order to work on a system change. And then also always be aware of where your own community is in terms of the overall spectrum of communities. So what's the culture like? What's your economy like? How much of a built environment do you have that sort of has a lot of really great bones to it? And then you have to, you know, tailor your own solutions to fit somewhere on that spectrum. You know, we have some community cultures that are very, very conservative, some that are very liberal. There's no right or wrong in any of that. You just have to understand, you know, where your community is and figure out which buttons you can push. And then, with apologies to Joe Minicozy, to also do the math. I did want to kind of lead with a few questions. I would love some comments and feedback and questions about all of this. This is a different tack. Honestly, this is a different professional tack for me. I spent a fair portion of my career working with clients doing sprawl repair projects and, you know, suburban retrofit projects, developers and cities. And we learned a lot through that process. And it was interesting to figure out in those cases which were the projects that really worked and took off and which were the ones that just never got any traction. But we've done a lot of that. I've worked with developers who sort of approached it with a pretty modest investment, and then also cities who literally spent millions and millions of dollars and had incredible commitment from city staff and elected officials, and still basically just couldn't move the needle. And so I'm here to say it's really hard. So figure out in some cases how you can opt out of that system entirely and create something. So I put a few questions on here. I don't know, do we have any elected officials or appointed commissioners in the room? Okay. I would love to hear thoughts and feedback on the politics of this kind of approach. People who are working in transportation, especially given the way the money flows today, whether it's federal money that flows through your state or through an MPO or local money. And then if we I don't think we're gonna have time today, but I think an exercise that you all could take home. I know Chris Lineberger did this in the Boston region, which was to sort of take an estimate of the potential demand. This is a really good way to think about this. That is a pretty easy math problem. Is look at the population of your region, your county, and then do a ballpark figure about what you think the demand is for these sort of different scales of living. So National Association of Realtors has some fantastic survey work they've been doing the last few years that is as nuanced as anybody has done about what people's preferences are. And the reason I like their work is they're asking people about the trade-offs. They're not just saying, hey, would you like to have a great big house with a big yard? And people go, yes, I'd love to have that. They don't do that. They say, would you rather live in a smaller home that had on a smaller lot where you could walk and ride a bike to different amenities, or would you rather have a larger home on a larger lot? And the answers are very revealing in those surveys. I have extrapolated just from experience over the years, looking at our own county and region. I think probably about 10% of our market really wants sort of the big city urban lifestyle, about 15% small city, about 25% really would probably like that small town urbanism, and probably half really like their, suburbia the way it is. And so the interesting math homework then for you is even if you just take those numbers, they're going to be different for every region, but let's say you go with those numbers and then look at it on a map of your region and figure out what that means for the ultimate built area. Chris Lineberger did this in the Boston region, and Boston obviously has a tremendous wealth of older neighborhoods that are really fantastic and old urbanism. And he came to the conclusion that they only needed 1% of the land area in the Boston region to account for the demand, which is pretty interesting. So that kind of concludes where I wanted to go. I would love to have some questions, discussion, comments from you all.
We're starting to get into tackling some of the comprehensive planning and coming at it a little bit of asking this question of what do people want, and we're in Texas, so we've got a whole bunch of the suburban stuff. But the question I guess that I'm curious about is there are a lot of people that like suburban and want to stay there until you let them know that the city doesn't have money to maintain it.
Right.
So the other question that we started to ask is what are your citizens, or what are you, Jim Bob, willing and able to pay for?
Right.
And when you put that caveat, it completely changes people's answers. So, well, I love my suburb, but if property taxes have to double, or if you're going to have to charge me higher impact fees for water, streets, what have you, I can't afford that. So then, and then you start to get into the whole messy middle housing conversation. But have you gotten into any of that?
I haven't gotten into that in Savannah. No, we've been trying to start that conversation in Savannah, and Chuck and Joe Minicozy came last year and really laid that out for people, and we're making progress on having that. But it's an extraordinarily difficult conversation to have, and so I think that's an incredible way to go about it. And putting real math to the expenses and revenues is very important. I think the only concern I have is ultimately about the pushback that we get from people who just look. A lot of this stuff is emotional. It's not rational. It's not. I mean, we try to be rational, but it's just not. And like the discussion I had yesterday, about this one street, going through downtown, it's completely emotion. People are just terrified that they might sit at a stoplight for 2 minutes, when they're driving. There's no basis in reality for any of it. And I think where I'm going with a lot of this is it's going to be impossible to convince the entire culture that, X is right and Y is wrong. So do what we can where we can, and make it really, really good, and make it pay for itself. And then over time, this is the hard part, but over time, you'll have enough of a constituency that will get it and will value it, and they'll push everybody else. But because right now, I think the risk in any of that, maybe you've experienced this, maybe you can tell me, is people just not believing it and pushing back and saying you're trying to social engineer our community. Yeah.
Well, and I think the second part of that is you, I mean, Chuck's talked about this when we come in for it, and you're kind of in it too, but then you get the triage that there's communities that they're just gonna have to let some of those places go. And, you know, as much as we want to try to keep that from happening, I think that's basically what you're saying, right? Making places that we can.
Yeah.
See what
It's a really,
revenue that gives the community.
it's a,
Some other places, and then
yeah, I mean, it's a terribly depressing way to think about it. I admit it, but yeah. Go to Chuck and then back.
I want to ask on Kevin's question, because this is what our debate was a couple years ago.
Yeah.
And the people who advocate for suburban retrofit or sprawl repair, whatever you want to call it, there's a very strong social justice component with that. How dare you suggest we leave people behind? How dare you insinuate that some neighborhoods aren't worthy of our affection and making them great places? And I hear Kevin saying, like, the reality is we're not gonna be able to take care of all this stuff. So how would you respond to someone who said, you know, we have a moral obligation to take care of it all?
Well, I mean, and that's a great question. I mean, it's really, really tough. We have had a pretty long history of leaving people behind as we've changed our development patterns. And I don't have great answers for that. I really don't. I think at some point, it's like your discussion last night, we have a predicament. And some of these are not problems, they're predicaments, and they're going to have outcomes no matter what. And there is a fair amount of our suburbia that is already falling into sort of social despair. And we're just not going to be able to save it all. I think in the end, what we'll see and what will happen is we just won't have the money to fix it all or to do enough about it. And so we're going to have to focus our resources on what we can do. I wish we were more proactive as a people, and we could really be proactive and deal more with the social problems up front. But it just doesn't seem to be in our nature in a lot of ways to be proactive. We tend to be reactive, wait for bad things to happen, then react. But I think the money equation is going to be different. I'll just tell you a quick money story too. You know, if you follow the news at all, obviously, you're seeing that, you know, at the federal level, there's a huge discussion about not just infrastructure, but, you know, the new administration slashing transit funding and, you know, all sorts of things that are going on. And all of you working at the local level know how tight money is as well. You know, our city is in a boom time right now, an absolute boom time. And we had an $8 million deficit last year that we had to close with emergency sort of stopgap funding. And this year's budget, there is zero money for infrastructure and zero capital money for infrastructure in our city budget. And this is when economic times are good. And so that's kind of a scary thought. Some of that can be fixed with better management. You know, there is mismanagement that happens, but there's only so far that's going to go. So these are going to be tough questions for all of us. So I think you had a question back here in the back. Yeah, they have a mechanism in the state of Missouri called a Transportation Development District, which is basically just another sort of value capture mechanism, essentially. They use a combination of property and sales tax capture within a defined area. It's not without controversy. You know, these things are not without controversy. And essentially Dennis, were like 300 people that had to vote on it, something like that, to approve it. I mean, it's a really small number of people that ended up voting to approve it, but that's how they funded it, was essentially like a value capture mechanism. And the extension of it is the next extension will be a similar type of vote. So it's just capture, you have to look at your state law and what your state allows. But Missouri allows for sort of a property and sales tax capture to be able to do transportation projects. And I think they did get a little bit of federal money. They didn't start doing federal money. The irony of all this is we had an advocacy group, 15 years ago that was pushing the city and the transit agency to do exactly this, just to do a starter line and fund it all locally. Look, I mean, our city, most of our cities can find enough wealth and enough money to do small transit enhancements like this, but there's just it's such a routine that we get into. We look at it and there's like, oh, there's free money at the federal level. We got to get that free money, which of course, has traditionally been very competitive and adds about 10 years to the project. So they pursued first, they lined up their local funding, and then they got a little sweetener from the feds, I think a Tiger grant to help construction.
I think your schematic for looking at different urban areas and measuring risk versus reward is just genius. I really like that presentation. And I can make good sense of how you position certain urban areas. I mean, rural, ex-urban, obviously, post-World War II, post-interstate suburbia, and so forth. But in the upper left-hand corner, I'd be really interested in a little bit more of the granularity of how you position those different urban areas. Because, I mean, for instance, just looking at it here, it seems to me that you think that there's a small but distinct advantage that perhaps a small city has over a big city in terms of trying to find some sort of sweet spot between reward and risk.
Mm-hmm.
What's kind of the fine math or fine details behind that position?
That's a great question. I appreciate that. Boy, that's the fun thing about doing anything like this, is when somebody actually looks at the nuance of what you're doing. That's great. So it's nice being around smart people. So the thought process I had there was, look, small town urbanism, obviously, as we know it, is often very cheap, inexpensive, easy to do. A lot of it is built around 1, 2, and 3-story construction, very modest approaches to development.
Just one main arterial.
Right. Right. In fact, I've kind of argued for years that there's any number of our cities and urban neighborhoods that can learn a lot by just doing really nice one-story retail town centers, that you don't necessarily have to go to the full mixed use for it to be great. If you look around at a lot of the neighborhoods that still remain intact from the teen 20s, you'll see a lot of that, and it can be really good. Easy to develop, easy to build. You can just get it going right away. Small city urbanism is that sort of next scale up. There's an incredible value lift that happens when you go to the next scale up to, say, somewhere from 4 to 6 or 7-story buildings and townhouse scale and small apartment scale living. So there's a huge revenue boost that comes to a city in that regard. And it can be done incrementally so that the risk is pretty minimal. And that's really how most of our cities evolved in this country through the end of the 19th century. They generally started, obviously, as sort of the small town. And then if they evolved into sort of small city urbanism as they developed and grew, with a lot of what we call the missing middle types, and then more substantial urban buildings. And then but so it's slightly riskier, I feel like, because anytime you're doing bigger buildings, more intensity, there's more money, it's riskier. But the upside is huge when you go from that general increase in scale. Then when you go to the big city urb, obviously there's a tremendous value difference that you can also achieve there. But anytime you're doing buildings and places of this intensity that you can even look around you here in downtown Tulsa, much riskier investments, much more expensive. And not that they aren't all, worth it, but it's just a whole different level of risk profile than you would have in doing a 20-story building versus doing a 5-story building.
So, I'm just to push you a little further. This is a huge conceptual and taxonomic debate, but what are you calling small city and what are you calling big city? You must have a line somewhere.
Yeah, I think. Well, the problem is I'm an architect, and so I have the biases of being an architect, right? So I tend to look at things like buildings. So Chuck is an engineer. He looks at engineering things. I'm an architect. I think about buildings. So I think a little bit about the difference between doing mid-rise construction and high-rise construction. That's kind of where it breaks off for me. Yes, 1 minute. One more question. In the back.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I thought it was interesting how you were saying, okay, this percentage wants big city urbanism, this amount wants small city urban, and this amount wants suburban. There seems to be a little bit of a talk about a sort of, trend towards, maybe millennials or younger people, rejecting some of the suburban model and wanting more of the experience and a lot of sort of trendiness around mixed use development. Do you think there's sort of a shift towards more urbanism, or it's more of a response to the market factors that certain things are more affordable, or what your thoughts are on that?
Well, there's no question that there's a shift. And if you track the surveys, again, that realtors and others have been doing for 10, 15, 20 years, it's pretty easy to look and see the percentage of people who are really interested in, broadly speaking, in urban living versus suburban living. So when I graduated from college in the early 90s, that percentage was, probably about, in the surveys, was about 15 or 20% of people in my age range who really were interested in urban living, which, by the way, was higher than it had been 10 years before that. And the current surveys of people, in their teens and 20s today, it is 50% or more. So there's no question that there has been a shift. There are a lot of reasons for that. I'll tell you, I think one of the reasons that the shift has happened is because cities are just better now. They're much more attractive and better. And when I was coming out of college, most cities were pretty awful. And it was harder for people to see themselves living in a lot of urban neighborhoods because they just needed so much work. And now most of our cities have really just gotten immensely better. And so it feeds on itself over time. The better they get, the more interesting they become, the more lively they become, the more it attracts more people. So I don't think that millennials are any kind of a different breed of human than people my age or older. But I do think there's no question that there is a shift that has been happening over time more towards urban living. Okay, thank you all very much.